She put her hand on his arm right there at the table, our table, the one I had reserved 6 weeks early, because the restaurant fills up fast in October. And she laughed at something he said like it was the funniest thing she had heard in years. I was sitting right across from them both. She looked at me and said, "You remember Marcus, don't you? We went to high school together. He's an old family friend." I nodded. I even smiled. I reached across and shook the man's hand. But here is the about spending 31 years on a fire crew. You learn very quickly that the most dangerous moment is not when the flames are visible. It is the 30 seconds before, when the smoke is still thin and the room still looks fine and your body is already telling you something your brain has not caught up to yet. That is when people get killed in burning buildings. Not when they can see the fire. When they cannot see it yet and choose to believe they are safe. That night at dinner, my body knew. My name is Ray Callahan. I am 62 years old. I retired from the Phoenix Fire Department after 31 years of service, the last 9 as a battalion chief. I worked my way up from a standard engine crew, spent 3 decades making decisions in smoke and heat and near total darkness, and finished my career with every man and woman who ever ran a shift under me still alive and accounted for. I say that not to impress you. I say it because I need you to understand the baseline, who I was, what I had learned to trust in myself, before I tell you how completely I had been trained not to trust it. Sandra and I met when I was 24 and she was 23. She was working the front desk at a medical clinic in Scottsdale when I came in for a mandatory annual physical before my 2nd year on the crew. She handed me a clipboard and told me the doctor was running 40 minutes behind, and we talked for almost that entire time about her family in Tucson, my obsession with rebuilding old truck engines. The way Phoenix sunsets look different in October than any other month. By the time the nurse called my name, I had already made up my mind. I was not good at many things outside of my work, but I was very sure about people. We were married 3 years later. 36 years after that, she invited another man to our anniversary dinner and called him an old family friend. I want you to understand something about Sandra before I tell you what she did, because I think this story only makes sense if you see the whole picture, not just the ending. She was there for the hard years. The years before the promotions, when the money was tight enough that we budgeted groceries and skipped vacations and told ourselves it was temporary. She never complained about any of it, not once. Not in a way that made me feel small. When our daughter Carla was born 6 weeks early and spent 11 days in the NICU, Sandra did not leave that hospital. She slept in the chair beside the incubator, and she held my hand in the corridor outside when the neonatologist gave us the first frightening update, and she said with complete steadiness, "She's going to be fine." She said it like she had information no one else had. I believed her. Carla is 31 now and completely healthy, and the main reason I get out of bed every morning with something to look forward to. When I was injured on the job in 2008, a structural collapse during a warehouse fire in the East Valley, nothing that would have made the news, just a bad day in a long career, Sandra drove to the hospital before they had finished setting my arm. She sat with me through the imaging and the conversations with the orthopedic surgeon and the follow-up appointments for 3 months afterward, and she never once made me feel like I was a burden during the recovery. She changed my dressings. She drove me to physical therapy. She told me I was going to be fine, and she was right again. That is who Sandra was for a long time. I do not know exactly when it changed. I have thought about this more than I should have, and I have arrived at the conclusion that it does not particularly matter. What I know is that in the last several years before our anniversary dinner, something had shifted in the way we inhabited the same house. She had become harder to reach. Not cold exactly. Sandra was never cold. More like she had moved herself slightly out of range. She was present, but not quite available. She laughed at things, but not the things I said. She had opinions about everything, but she shared fewer of them with me. She was still my wife in all the functional ways. She just was not quite on my side anymore in the way she had once been. I had noticed this the way you notice a gradual change in light, not as a single moment, but as a slow accumulation that one day you recognize as a pattern. And every time I had tried to name it, Sandra would say with genuine-sounding patience, "Ray, you're doing the thing again. You're finding problems. We're fine. We've always been fine." She said it enough times and with enough warmth that I had started to believe it was my problem to manage, rather than a real thing happening between us. That is the part that I carry with me differently now. Not the affair. The years of being gently redirected away from my own clear sight. I found out later, months later, from a mutual friend who hadn't meant to say as much as she did, that Sandra and Marcus Del Rey had first reconnected at a high school reunion 3 years before that anniversary dinner. 3 years, whatever it had become it slowly and deliberately over 3 full years while I was sitting across from her at dinner every night believing that we were fine. Marcus Del Rey. I pulled his real estate license after everything came out, the way you pull a thread when something doesn't sit right and you need to know how far it goes. He operated a boutique residential practice out of a Scottsdale office, specializing, his website said this directly, in mountain properties and what he called second home transitions. He had a clean, professional profile. Good photographs. Glowing reviews from clients who described him as attentive, detail-oriented, and creative in finding solutions for complicated ownership situations. Complicated ownership situations. My attorney, Patricia, dug a little deeper into his transaction history after the title company meeting. She was not looking for anything specific. She was doing what she does, which is making sure she understands the full geography of a situation before she navigates it. What she found was a pattern in his listing history over the previous 4 years. Several mountain properties in the Prescott and Sedona corridors that had entered the market as jointly owned by a married couple and had gone to completion as single-owner sales, the transaction having been initiated by one party and finalized in a way that had required, at various points, consent processes and documentation transfers that his office had managed. Not illegal on its face, just a recurring situation that his practice seemed particularly experienced at handling. I thought about that for a long time. The word Patricia used was pattern. I used a different word to myself, alone in my truck on the drive home from her office. But I am getting ahead of the sequence. Let me go back to the dinner. The restaurant was a place in North Scottsdale that Sandra and I had been going to for anniversary dinners since the mid-90s. It meant something to both of us, or I had believed it did. The kind of place that knows your name when you walk in, that remembers you prefer the corner booth, that brings the good wine list without being asked. I had made the reservation in late August, 6 weeks early, the way I always did. I arrived before Sandra. I ordered sparkling water and straightened my jacket and thought about the fact that 36 years is a very long time to love the same person and how fortunate I was to have managed it. That is where my head was when she walked in. She was wearing a dress I hadn't seen before, a dark green one, fitted, the kind of thing she wore when she wanted to feel like the best version of herself. She looked beautiful. I stood up and kissed her cheek and said so, and she smiled and said thank you. And then she said, as she was sitting down, "I hope you don't mind." I ran into Marcus downtown this afternoon and invited him to join us for a drink. I told him we'd be here. He's just going to stop by briefly. She said it the way you say something you have already decided, framed as a question so that the other person feels included in a choice they were never actually given. I said that was fine. Marcus arrived 12 minutes later. He was in his mid-50s, tall, the kind of easy, assembled quality that suggests someone has spent decades making a good impression and no longer has to think about it. He shook my hand with the right amount of pressure and said he had heard so much about me and that it was great to finally meet. He had known Sandra since they were 17, he said. One of those friendships that just picks back up right where it left off no matter how much time passes. He ordered a drink and stayed for dinner. I watched them over the course of that meal with the attention I had spent 3 decades training, Not paranoid attention, not suspicious surveillance, but the specific, quiet focus of a person who has learned that what is visible is often less informative than what is not. I watched the way Marcus moved through the conversation, always slightly angled toward Sandra. I watched the way she laughed at things he said. Not the polite laugh she used with people she was merely being gracious toward, but the genuine kind, the one that crinkles the corners of her eyes. I watched the moment when he reached for the breadbasket and his hand briefly covered hers, and she let it stay there for just a beat too long before she shifted toward her wine glass. I watched her tell me I was imagining things before I had said a single word. That is the detail that has stayed with me the most in the months since. At some point toward the end of dinner, when Marcus had stepped away briefly, I said something mild, something about how the two of them seemed to have kept up well for people who hadn't seen each other in years. I said it neutrally. I was genuinely curious to hear what she would say. She put her wine glass down and looked at me with the particular expression she reserved for my firefighter brain moments. Patient, slightly tired, the face of a woman who has spent years managing an overcautious husband, and she said, "Ray, don't." Just that, don't. And then Marcus came back, and she became the brightest version of herself again, as though a switch had been thrown. I drove home that night, processing the precise mechanics of what had just happened. She had preemptively shut down a conversation I had not yet started. She had not waited for the accusation. She had redirected before there was anything to redirect, which meant she knew exactly what I was looking at and had decided to get ahead of it. That is not something innocent people do. I did not sleep well. Early the next morning, after Sandra left for a coffee appointment she mentioned before bed, I sat at the kitchen table with my phone and opened our shared calendar. We had maintained it together for 12 years. My shift rotations, her medical appointments, the grandkids' school events, the rhythm of a shared life reduced to a digital grid. I had never had any reason to look at it carefully. I scrolled back 4 months. On a Thursday in mid-August, there was an entry I had no memory of agreeing to. It read, M. Prescott Cabin Assessment, 10 a.m. It had been entered through a device logged into our shared account. That Thursday, I had spent the day helping my neighbor Bob clear storm debris from his fence line. Sandra had texted me around noon with a photo of the pasta she'd picked up at the store. She had been home, she had told me. I screenshotted the entry. I did not alter it. Then I went to my own email and searched for the cabin's address. There was a message I had received 6 weeks earlier which I had not opened carefully. The subject line had said, "Action required, Prescott property sale documentation," and I had moved it to a folder assuming it was routine county correspondence. I opened it now and read it in full. It was from a title company in Flagstaff. They were writing to inform me that a listing inquiry had been submitted for our cabin property. The inquiry had been filed under a single seller's name. As co-owner of record on the deed, I was being contacted to confirm whether I intended to participate in or waive my position in the sale proceeding. Waive my position as co-signatory. I set the phone down on the table. The cabin was not just a property on a balance sheet. We had purchased it in 2003 with 22 years of overtime savings. Money I had built by working holidays, by staying on through shift extensions, by skipping the vacations other guys took. We had paid cash for it because I do not believe in owing money on something that is supposed to be a refuge. I had rebuilt the deck boards over 4 consecutive summer weekends. I had replumbed the interior after a freeze cracked 2 main lines. I had driven up there alone after my father died and sat on that porch for 2 days, saying almost nothing to anyone. Just listening to the pines and letting the grief work its way through at its own pace. That cabin was the most deliberate thing I had ever built with the earnings of my working life. And someone filed a sale inquiry on it without my name on the paperwork. I called the title company from the driveway of my own house, sitting in my truck in the October morning cold. The woman who answered was patient and professional. She pulled the file. She confirmed the inquiry. She confirmed the address. She confirmed that the filing had listed only one party as seller and that the system had automatically flagged the discrepancy because the deed showed co-ownership. She could not name the representing agent in that initial call, but she confirmed that no sale process could advance without both co-owners' documented participation. She also confirmed, carefully, in the tone of someone who has navigated this exact territory before, that the original submission had not included my contact information as a participating party. Sandra's name and contact details only. I thanked her. I got her full name and the case reference number. I asked for a hold on all forward movement, pending my written response. Then I called Patricia. Patricia has handled my legal affairs for 14 years. She is the kind of attorney who treats every piece of information like a load-bearing element and checks each one before she adds weight. I told her what I had found. The calendar entry, the title company email, the phone call, the anniversary dinner Marcus Del Rey. I told her all of it in order and without editorializing. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Do not touch the cabin, do not confront Sandra, do not contact the realtor, keep your phone charged, and do not delete anything. Let me make some calls." I said I understood. She said, "Ray, she doesn't know you know. That matters. Don't give it away." I said I understood that too. What followed was 3 days of the most demanding performance of my life, and I say that as a man who spent 3 decades running towards situations that everyone else was running away from. I sat across from Sandra at breakfast and asked her if she wanted the last of the orange juice. I watched the news with her in the evenings and made the appropriate comments when she said something about whatever story was on. I went to bed at a reasonable hour and lay in the dark listening to her sleep and thought, "You have no idea." She did not, and that was the only advantage I had going into what came next. Patricia called back on the 3rd day. She had confirmed through title company documentation that the inquiry had been submitted by Marcus Del Rey, licensed real estate agent, Scottsdale office, operating as the representing agent for a single seller. The filing had misrepresented the ownership structure, listing Sandra as sole owner of a property that was legally co-owned, and the title company's system had correctly generated the notification to my email as a result. She had also reviewed Marcus's transaction history going back 4 years. She was careful in how she described what she found. She said, "There is a pattern of mountain property transactions in his history where a jointly owned asset entered the market as a single owner sale. His office appears to be experienced at managing the documentation process in those situations." She paused. "I'm not saying it's all the same story. I'm saying this isn't his first time." I did not ask her to say more than that. I did not need more than that. Patricia arranged a formal meeting at the title company's Flagstaff office. Myself, Sandra, both attorneys, and the title agent managing the file. The notification to Sandra described it as routine co-owner participation in sale documentation review. The word Marcus did not appear anywhere in that notification. On the Tuesday morning of the meeting, I arrived 10 minutes early and sat in the lobby with a paper coffee cup and watched the elevator. The building was on a wide commercial street lined with pines, cold, clear, still. The kind of morning that makes everything feel like it has already been decided. Sandra came in at 9:48. She had dressed carefully, good coat, hair done, the composed presentation of a woman who expected to walk into a manageable situation and walk back out. She came around the corner from the elevator and saw me sitting beside Patricia, and her face changed. Not dramatically, nothing so theatrical, just a very specific shift, the expression of a person who has run a careful plan for a long time and has just realized that one of the foundational assumptions was wrong. She had brought an attorney, a younger man named Stephen, who had, I later understood, been retained 2 weeks before that meeting. She had been planning this for longer than I knew. We went upstairs. The title agent, a composed man named Gerald, 20-plus years in that chair, clearly unbothered by the texture of the room, walked through the documentation with the methodical steadiness of someone who knows that facts are not emotional, even when the people around them are. He confirmed the co-ownership structure, He confirmed the submission date of the inquiry. He confirmed the discrepancy that had generated the notification to me. He confirmed that the hold was in place. He looked at me and asked, "Mr. Callahan, is it your intent to participate in this sale proceeding?" I said it was not. He made a note. Patricia laid a single-page letter on the table. Not a legal action, not a threat. Just a formal record that I had received the notification, had reviewed the inquiry, and was exercising my right as co-owner to decline participation. Any future inquiry would require my documented consent before progress could be made. Stephen reviewed it. He had no grounds to challenge it. The property was co-owned and that had not changed. The letter was simply the written version of something that was already legally true. It was Sandra who broke the silence. She looked across the table at me, and for a moment, I thought she was going to take the dignified route. Stay quiet, let the attorneys handle it, preserve whatever composure she had walked in with. But something shifted in her face. I have seen that shift before in people under pressure who have held something in too long and lose the ability to keep holding. She said, "You could have just talked to me, Ray." The room stayed quiet. I said, "You told me not to at dinner. You said don't," before I had said anything. Her jaw tightened. "That is not what happened." "The calendar entry has a date and a time, Sandra. The title company has a file number. Would you like to tell me what happened?" She looked at Patricia. She looked at Stephen. She looked at Gerald, who was making careful notations in the file and giving no indication that he found any of this unusual. Then she looked back at me. "You have no idea how lonely it has been," she said. "You were never home. You were always at the station or at Bob's or up at that cabin alone. For years. And when you were home, you were watching the news or in the garage. I stopped being a person to you. I became furniture." I let her finish. I said, "I hear you, and I am genuinely sorry if that is how it felt. But those feelings don't explain why my name was left off a sale inquiry on a property we bought together." I was going to tell you. "When, Sandra?" She did not answer that. "After it sold?" I said. "After the money was moved? After Marcus had taken his commission on a transaction that removed my name from something I built?" She looked away. Her hands on the table were very still. Stephen put a hand briefly on her arm, a signal to stop. She stopped. Gerald collected the documents. He noted the status in the file. He said the inquiry was formally paused pending resolution of co-owner participation. He thanked us for coming in and meant none of it personally. Sandra and I rode the elevator down separately. In the parking lot, the wind had picked up. She was standing on the sidewalk with her collar turned up when I came out. She said my name once, just Ray, the way you say something when you have not decided what comes after it. I said, "I know how long it's been going on. I know it started at the reunion 3 years ago. I'm not interested in the details. I'm telling you so you understand that I did not stumble into this meeting unprepared." She looked at me for a long time. I said, "The cabin is not for sale. Not now. Not in 6 months. Not through any process that doesn't have both our names on it as willing parties. I think we both know what the next steps look like." She did not deny a single thing. That was the moment the marriage became past tense. Not at the dinner table. Not in the title company conference room. In a parking lot in Flagstaff on cold Tuesday morning in November, when Sandra Callahan looked at me and simply stopped pretending. The months that followed were the slow, unglamorous mechanics of ending something built over decades. Attorneys, appraisals, mediation, property negotiations, a great deal of paperwork moving across a great many desks. Patricia managed the documentation of my role in the cabin purchase, the savings records, the construction receipts, the maintenance history over 20 years, thoroughly enough that the negotiation over the cabin was not close. Sandra had other priorities. The cabin came to me clear. The divorce was finalized 8 months after the Flagstaff meeting. Marcus Del Rey's practice in Scottsdale, I am told, is still active. His website still shows mountain properties. I stopped looking at it a long time ago. I drove up to Prescott for the first time after everything on a cold Saturday in February. I parked at the end of the drive and stood looking at the cabin for a few minutes before going in. The deck I'd rebuilt board by board. The woodpile I'd stacked the previous spring. The pine on the east corner that still needed trimming. I went inside and made coffee on the old propane stove and carried the mug out to the porch and sat in the camp chair I have had since the mid-90s, the one with the busted left armrest I have never replaced, and I watched the light move through the trees until the cold drove me inside. It did not feel like winning. I want to be clear about that. There was no fist raised, no satisfaction, nothing that resembled triumph. What it felt like was the specific, exhausted quiet of a fire that has burned through everything flammable and finally gone out on its own, not because someone defeated it, because there was nothing left to burn. In July, Carla brought her husband and the grandkids up for 4 days. The kids slept on the floor in the main room and complained about the thin mattresses and loved every minute of it. My grandson Eddie found a woodpecker hole in the big pine by the east fence and called everyone outside like he had discovered something unknown to science. We made a fire in the pit on the last evening and sat around it until it was fully dark, and the pines were just shapes against the stars. That is what I was protecting when I read that title company email carefully enough to pick up the phone. That is what I was protecting when I stopped letting someone convince me that seeing the smoke was the same as starting the fire. I have been in enough fires to know the difference. If any part of this story is familiar to you, if you are somewhere right now with that quiet feeling that something is not right, that the room looks fine, but your body is telling you something your brain has not caught up to yet, then pay attention to it. Do not talk yourself out of it. You have spent your whole life learning to read the situation you are actually in. Trust that. Let me go back and fill in the part of the story I moved through too quickly. The middle weeks, the ones between the anniversary dinner and the Flagstaff meeting, because I think those weeks are actually the heart of what I want to tell you. After I called the title company and spoke with Patricia, I had 3 days in which I knew something that Sandra did not know I knew. 3 days of sitting in the same house, eating at the same table, watching the same evening news, and saying nothing. I have been asked since, by people who know what happened, how I managed that. My answer is always the same. I had spent 31 years learning to hold steady in rooms that were actively trying to kill me. 3 days of a kitchen table was not the hardest thing I had ever done. But I would be lying if I said it was easy. The hardest part was not the performance of normalcy. The hardest part was the moments in between. The moments when Sandra did something ordinary and kind, the way she had always done, and I had to hold in my mind simultaneously who she was in that moment and what she had been arranging in the background. She refilled my coffee without being asked on the first morning. She left a note on the counter when she went to meet a friend, the way she had for 30 years, with her schedule and her phone number, written in her particular handwriting. She asked me on the second evening how Bob's fence repairs were holding up after the last storm. These were not the actions of a person who felt guilty. They were the actions of a person who had fully compartmentalized, who had separated the version of the marriage that happened at the kitchen table from the version that was being arranged in the background without my name on it. And I think that compartmentalization, the ease of it, the complete absence of visible strain, told me more about what the last several years had actually been than anything I found in the calendar or the email. Because that is the thing about betrayal in a long marriage that people do not talk about enough. It does not always look like tension or distance or obvious signs. Sometimes it looks exactly like normal. Sometimes the person who is quietly arranging to sell your cabin looks up from their book and asks if you want the last of the orange juice, and means it, and hands it to you, and none of it is false in the moment it is happening. The compartmentalization is total. And what that tells you, when you finally understand it, is that the distance you had been sensing for years was not conflict. It was the natural byproduct of a life being quietly built in parallel to yours. I had been sensing that parallel life for a long time, Sandra had taught me, over years, to call that sensing a flaw in my personality. On the third evening, she asked me whether I thought we should go up to the cabin before the first real cold came. She said she had been thinking about it, that the gutters might need clearing before winter. She said it with the completely normal tone of a person discussing household maintenance. She was not performing it. She genuinely believed the conversation was exactly what it appeared to be. I said that sounded like a good idea. I said I would look at the calendar. The amount of self-control that response required is something I am not entirely proud of, and something I am also entirely at peace with. Patricia called back the next morning with everything she had found: the Marcus transaction history, the pattern in the Prescott and Sedona corridors, the documentation timeline. She laid it out with her usual efficiency. No drama, just the architecture of what had been built without my knowledge. Then she told me about the meeting she had arranged. I want to tell you about the week before the Flagstaff meeting because I think it matters for the people watching this who are in the middle of something similar. I knew by that point that the cabin was not at risk. The legal situation was clear. Patricia had confirmed it. The title company had confirmed it. Whatever Marcus and Sandra had been arranging, they had hit a wall they did not know existed before they walked into it. But knowing you are going to be okay and feeling like you are going to be okay are two entirely separate experiences, and I was not feeling okay. I drove out to the desert one afternoon that week, to a stretch of open land east of Mesa, where I sometimes go when I need to think without interruption. I parked the truck and sat on the tailgate and looked at the mountains. It was a cold afternoon but clear, the kind of light that makes everything look precise and a little merciless. I thought about the warehouse fire in 2008. I thought about the 11 days Sandra had sat in that NICU room when Carla was born early. I thought about the anniversary dinners going back 20 years, the corner booth, the good wine list. I thought about Marcus reaching across the breadbasket with his practiced, comfortable ease. And I thought about something my old captain used to say during training drills. He would tell the newer crew members, "The building does not care how you feel about it. The fire does not care. Your feelings about the situation are not the situation. The situation is the situation. Read it accurately and respond to what is actually there, not to what you wish were there, and not to what someone told you was there." I had spent 31 years applying that principle to burning structures. I had spent 36 years of a marriage slowly letting it be taught out of me. Sitting on the tailgate that afternoon, I made a decision. Not about the cabin, not about the meeting. A quieter decision than either of those. I decided that I was not going to spend whatever time I had left arguing with my own clear sight. Not ever again. Not for anyone. I drove home. I made dinner. Sandra came in from wherever she had been that afternoon and said it smelled good. I said thank you. That was the last ordinary evening I spent in that house pretending everything was fine. 4 days later, we went to Flagstaff. After the meeting, after the parking lot, after Sandra stopped pretending, I drove back to Phoenix alone. I stopped at a gas station outside of Cordis Junction and bought a bad cup of coffee and stood beside my truck for a few minutes, watching the traffic on the interstate. Semi-trucks heading north. A family in a minivan heading south with a load of luggage on the roof rack. Ordinary life in every direction. I thought, 36 years. I thought, she said I was imagining things. I thought, I was not imagining things. And then I got back in the truck and drove home, because there was work to do and it was not going to do itself. The divorce proceedings lasted 8 months. They were not ugly. I give both of us credit for that. Patricia was thorough without being aggressive. Stephen was professional. There were difficult conversations, and there were moments when I sat in a conference room, looking across a table at the woman I had been married to for 36 years, and felt the full weight of what was being unmade, and I am not going to pretend otherwise. It is a loss. Even when the loss is the right outcome, it is still a loss. The years were real. The hospital room was real. The early morning drives to a cabin in the pines were real. None of that becomes false because the ending was wrong. But here is what I know. Carla calls me twice a week. My grandson Eddie has decided he wants to be a mechanic specifically because of the summer he spent at the cabin, watching me tune the old generator, and he asks me questions about engines that I genuinely enjoy answering. My neighbor Bob and I spent 3 weekends last fall rebuilding the east section of his fence line, and then sat on his porch afterward eating bad sandwiches and watching the October light go flat across the desert. And the cabin is there, in the pines, with the deck I built and the woodpile I stacked and the old camp chair with the busted armrest that I will probably never replace. My name is on the deed, mine alone now. I could not have told you. Sitting in that restaurant in October, watching Sandra laugh at something Marcus said, that I was about to find out exactly who I was when the moment required it. I could not have told you that the firefighter brain I had spent years being gently corrected for was the only thing standing between me and the quiet disappearance of something I had built with the best of what I had. But that is what happened. So if you are somewhere right now with that particular feeling, the room looks fine, the smoke is thin, your brain is telling you to stand down, but something else in you is saying, pay attention. I want you to listen to that something else. You are not paranoid. You are not difficult. You are not finding problems where none exist. You are reading the room you are actually in. Trust what you know. Subscribe to Charles Revenge. Leave a comment below. Tell us what you would have done at that dinner table, or tell us about a time someone told you that you were imagining things when you weren't. We want to hear it. We will be right here.